The office was buzzing with the usual Monday morning chaos. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, and employees hurried from one meeting to the next. No one seemed to notice the man standing just inside the front doors, taking in the familiar surroundings, with quiet hesitation. His name was Daniel Carter, and he had once been a respected employee here before he left to serve in the military. Years had passed since then, years filled with battles, both on the field and within himself. Now, with his service behind him, he had finally decided to return, not knowing what to expect. His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple button-up shirt and slacks. A neatly trimmed beard covered his strong jawline, and his deep-set eyes carried the weight of experiences most people in this office would never understand. He took a slow, steady breath and stepped forward. As he approached the front desk, the young receptionist barely looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but dismissive. Daniel hesitated before answering. "I used to work here. I was hoping to see if my old position is still available." The receptionist frowned, glancing at her computer screen. "Your name?" "Daniel Carter." She typed quickly, her fingers tapping against the keys. After a moment, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I don't see your name in our system." Daniel nodded as if he had expected that. He wasn't sure why he thought they would still remember him. It had been years after all. But just as he was about to turn away, a voice cut through the office noise. "Did you say Daniel Carter?" A few heads turned as a man in an expensive suit stepped forward, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. The air in the room shifted, the energy suddenly tense with unspoken emotions. Daniel met his gaze, confused. "Yeah, that's me." The man's jaw clenched, his eyes locked onto Daniel like he was seeing a ghost. "Follow me," he said, his voice tight. "Right now." Daniel had no idea what was about to happen, but as he followed the man through the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that his return was about to stir up something far bigger than he ever anticipated. The man led Daniel through the sleek, modern office, past rows of desks where employees stole curious glances. There was something about the way he moved, fast, determined, almost tense. Daniel studied him as they walked. The man's sharp suit and confident posture suggested power, authority. He wasn't just another employee. Finally, they reached a large office at the end of the hallway. The man pushed open the glass door and motioned for Daniel to step inside. As soon as the door shut behind them, he turned around, eyes narrowed. "I can't believe it," he muttered almost to himself. "After all these years, Daniel Carter." Daniel frowned, confused. "I'm sorry, but do I know you?" The man let out a short, humorless laugh. "I guess you wouldn't remember me. I was just a junior analyst when you left. Back then, you were one of the best employees in the company. Everyone looked up to you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And now?" The man straightened, his expression unreadable. "Now I run this company." Daniel's stomach tightened. He hadn't expected this. "You're the CEO?" "That's right," the man said. "Mark Bennett. I remember you well, Daniel. But I have to ask, why are you here now?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I served my time in the military. I came back hoping to rebuild my life. I thought maybe my old job was still open." Mark studied him carefully. "You just showed up expecting to pick up where you left off?" Daniel met his gaze without flinching. "Not expecting, just hoping." For a long moment, Mark said nothing. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There's something you don't know, Daniel. Something about this company, about what happened after you left." Daniel's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" Mark hesitated, then finally spoke. "Your departure changed everything, and not in the way you think." Daniel's brow furrowed as he studied Mark's face. There was something unsettling in his expression, like he was holding back something. "Important." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked slowly. Mark let out a breath and gestured for him to sit. He leaned against his desk, folding his arms. "After you left, the company changed. The leadership at the time, they weren't exactly supportive of employees who had outside commitments. When you deployed, they used it as an excuse to restructure." Daniel clenched his jaw. They fired me, Mark nodded. Not just you. A few others too. Anyone who they thought wasn't reliable in their eyes. His voice was edged with frustration. But what they didn't realize was how much you meant to this place. You weren't just another employee, Daniel. You were the heart of this company's culture. People respected you, looked up to you. Daniel's stomach tightened. He had never thought of himself that way. He had just been doing his job. Mark continued. After you left, morale dropped. Employees started leaving, and when word got out about what happened to you, clients pulled their contracts. The company nearly collapsed. Daniel sat back in shock. He had assumed his departure had gone unnoticed. That life here had continued as usual. But now he realized that wasn't the case. Mark ran a hand through his hair. When I took over as CEO, I made sure things changed, but I never forgot what happened to you. His eyes locked onto Daniel's. So tell me, what are you really looking for? Just a job? Or something more? Daniel thought for a moment. He had come here thinking he would just pick up where he left off, but now he wasn't sure. Before he could answer, there was a knock on the door. The receptionist peeked inside, looking nervous. Sir, there's a situation in the lobby. Mark's face hardened. What kind of situation? She hesitated. Someone from the board is here, and they're not happy. Daniel exchanged a glance with Mark. He could tell this was about him, and whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be simple. Mark straightened, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he strode toward the door, motioning for Daniel to follow. The tension in the air was thick as they made their way back to the lobby, where a small group of well-dressed executives stood, their expressions tight with disapproval. At the center of them was a man Daniel didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, and radiating authority. His sharp eyes locked onto Daniel the moment they entered the room. What is he doing here? The man demanded, his voice cold. Mark's jaw tightened. Daniel Carter is a former employee of this company. He came back looking for his job. The silver-haired man scoffed. We don't just hand out positions to people who abandoned their responsibilities. Daniel clenched his fists. I didn't abandon anything. I served my country. The man's expression remained indifferent. And that was your choice. This company moved on without you. A murmur spread through the employees who had gathered nearby, their gazes flicking between Daniel and the executives. Mark took a step forward, his voice firm. This company nearly fell apart because of what was done to Daniel. The board's decisions back then cost us loyal employees and clients. If anyone deserves a second chance, it's him. The silver-haired man's lips pressed into a thin line. That was years ago. The company survived and we've moved forward. This isn't about the past. Mark crossed his arms. Maybe not for you, but for the people who work here, it is. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in the older man's eyes. Daniel could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him. It was about the company's values, about righting a wrong that had been buried for too long. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Then, finally, the silver-haired man sighed. If you really want him back, he said, looking at Mark, then you're responsible for him. But if he fails, it's on you. Mark didn't hesitate. That's a risk I'm willing to take. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had expected rejection, maybe even indifference. But he hadn't expected someone to fight for him. As the executives turned and left, Mark looked at him with a small smirk. Welcome back, Carter. But as relieved as Daniel felt, something in his gut told him this wasn't over yet. The murmurs in the office hadn't settled even after the executives left. Employees whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Daniel. Some faces showed recognition, others curiosity, but there was no mistaking the shift in energy. His return had stirred something. Mark clapped him on the shoulder. Come on, let's get you settled. As they walked back through the office, Daniel noticed how people moved out of their way, not in fear, but in respect. Some nodded at him. A few even smiled. He wasn't sure if it was because of his military service or the reputation he apparently still had in this place. Mark led him to an empty office, its glass walls overlooking the main floor. It was simple, but it was more than he had expected. "You'll start here," Mark said. "I know you don't need anyone holding your hand, but I want you to get reacquainted with how things run now. A lot has changed." Daniel nodded, but before he could respond, a woman appeared in the doorway. She had dark hair pulled into a tight bun, her sharp features unreadable. "I need a word," she said, her tone clipped. Mark sighed. "Daniel, this is Vanessa Clark, our CFO." Daniel offered a polite nod, but Vanessa's gaze was locked on Mark. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Bringing him back?" Mark's expression didn't waver. "Because it's the right thing to do." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Some of the board members still hold grudges over what happened years ago. They're not going to just let this slide." Mark's jaw tightened. "Then let them come to me." Vanessa let out a slow breath, shaking her head. "I hope you know what you're doing." With one last glance at Daniel, she turned on her heel and left. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "She doesn't seem thrilled," Mark smirked. "She'll come around, but she's right about one thing. This isn't over. Some people will want to see you fail." Daniel met his gaze, his voice steady. "Then I won't give them the satisfaction." Mark chuckled. "That's the Daniel Carter I remember." But as Mark left him to settle in, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Daniel sat at his new desk, his fingers tracing the polished wood. It felt surreal being back. The office had changed, new faces, new technology, but beneath it all, it still felt familiar. Yet, he couldn't ignore the weight in his chest, the feeling that his return wasn't as simple as getting a job back. As he logged into the company system, emails flooded his inbox. Some were standard onboarding messages, but a few stood out. One, in particular, caught his eye. "Stay in your lane, Carter. Some things are better left buried." There was no sender name, no signature, just that one chilling line. Daniel's muscles tensed. He knew this wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Someone didn't want him here. Someone still held onto the past like a loaded gun. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He quickly closed the email. A young woman stepped inside, her auburn hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She looked hesitant, almost nervous. "Hi, Mr. Carter," she said. "I'm Emily, your assistant. Mark asked me to help you get settled." Daniel forced a small smile, pushing aside his unease. "Nice to meet you, Emily." She nodded but didn't move. Instead, she glanced toward the hallway, then back at him, lowering her voice. "Sir, I don't mean to overstep, but you should be careful." Daniel's heart slowed. Careful of what? Emily hesitated, then took a small step closer. "People are still bitter about what happened when you left. There were things swept under the rug, things no one talks about, and now that you're back, I think they're afraid you might start digging." Daniel studied her carefully. He had suspected there was more to this than just resentment. Now, he was sure of it. What exactly was swept under the rug? He asked. Emily swallowed hard, glancing at the door again. I don't know everything, but I do know that after you left, something happened with your old projects. Some deals, some money. Things didn't add up. Daniel's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about his job. This was bigger. Someone had used his absence to their advantage. And now that he was back, they were afraid he'd uncover the truth. Emily took a shaky breath. "I shouldn't be here. Just watch your back." With that, she hurried out, leaving Daniel sitting in the silence of his office, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. Whatever had happened all those years ago, whoever had been pulling the strings was still here, and they were watching him. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind whirring. He had come back to rebuild his life, but now he was stepping into something far bigger than he had expected. Someone had taken advantage of his departure, someone powerful enough to cover their tracks. His instincts from the military kicked in. If there was corruption buried in this company, he needed to find proof. Clicking through his old projects, he found them archived, but something felt off. The financial reports didn't line up with what he remembered. Profits had skyrocketed right after he left, but not in a way that made sense. Contracts he had worked on had been altered. Names had been erased. A specific project caught his eye. Project Horizon. Daniel remembered it well. It had been a major deal with an international tech firm, worth millions. But according to these records, the deal had been closed right after he left with a payout that didn't match the original agreement. Someone had funneled money. His gut tightened. Who had been in charge back then? He needed answers. Just as he was about to dig deeper, his office phone rang. He hesitated, then picked up. Carter. Silence, then a voice, low and controlled. You should have stayed gone. A click. The line went dead. Daniel set the phone down slowly, his pulse steady but his muscles tensed. First the email. Now this. Whoever was behind this wasn't just nervous. They were scared, and that meant he was getting close. Daniel stared at the phone, his fingers still hovering above the receiver. The voice on the other end had been cold, threatening, and all too familiar with him. His instincts screamed that this wasn't just an empty threat. Whoever it was had seen him as a target, and now he was their prey. He had to act fast. If they were watching him this closely, they knew he was already digging into the company's past. A knock at the door startled him, and he quickly grabbed his phone and shoved it in his pocket. Emily poked her head in, looking worried. Is everything okay? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel managed a half smile, trying to mask the tension. Yeah, everything's fine. Just business as usual. Emily didn't look convinced. She stepped into the office fully, her eyes scanning the room. Listen, I know you probably have a lot on your plate right now, but I wanted to warn you about something else. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What is it? She lowered her voice even further, her eyes darting around as though checking for eavesdroppers. There are whispers going around the office, people saying you shouldn't have come back, that the company's better off without you. That's how it was for years, you know. People just moved on. Moved on from me? Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice even. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with concern. You were a symbol of the old way. When you left, they erased all trace of you, your contributions, your projects, like you never existed. No one talks about it, but it's there. And now you're back. People don't like that. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. It was exactly what he had feared. The people in charge now wanted him to stay in the past, forgotten. But he wasn't about to let them bury the truth. Who exactly is spreading these rumors? Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Emily hesitated. It's not just one person, it's a few people, the higher-ups. And I'm not sure if they're just scared or if they're trying to protect something. But it's not just the employees, it's the board too. That was the key. The board. Whoever was trying to silence him was deeply embedded in the company's leadership. I'm going to need your help, Daniel said, his voice steady. Emily looked at him startled. What do you mean? I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I need access to everything. The old contracts, the financials, everything that happened while I was gone. Can you help me? She hesitated, glancing toward the door again. I want to, Daniel, but if they find out I helped you, it's over. I'll lose my job, and they'll make sure no one else will hire me. Daniel understood the risk, but he didn't have time to be cautious. We'll do this quietly. I need to know who's involved. And once I have the proof, they won't be able to touch either of us. She bit her lip, torn. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. I'll help, but only if you promise me one thing. Anything, Daniel said without hesitation. Don't let them win. With that, Emily turned and left, leaving Daniel with the weight of the task ahead. He was no longer just fighting for a job. He was fighting for the truth and for justice, for all the people who had been silenced along the way. But as he turned back to his computer, a sinking feeling filled his chest. The people who were trying to stop him weren't going to back down easily. The danger was real, and he couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The next few days were a blur of quiet conversations, hidden files, and a growing sense of urgency. Emily had started slipping him documents, emails, and spreadsheets, all of which painted a picture of deceit and manipulation. Each new piece of evidence he uncovered pushed him closer to the truth, but also deeper into danger. One evening, Daniel stayed late in the office, poring over the financials. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he couldn't stop now. The numbers didn't lie. The project he had worked on before leaving, Project Horizon, had been manipulated. The company had funneled millions through fake contracts, siphoning money to accounts linked to people who no longer worked there. Some of the names were familiar, others were new, but all of them were connected to the current leadership. Someone had made a fortune while Daniel was away. And they had done it at his expense. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The more he uncovered, the more he realized how far-reaching the corruption was. The entire structure of the company had been built on lies. His absence had been the perfect cover, but someone had to have known. Someone had to have helped orchestrate it. A sudden knock at the door made Daniel's heart skip a beat. He hadn't expected anyone at this hour. He quickly closed the laptop, trying to mask the panic. The door creaked open, and Emily stepped in, looking more anxious than he had ever seen her. "They know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They know you're digging. Someone saw me in the storage room. I don't know who, but they've been watching me." Daniel's chest tightened. "Emily, you need to stop. This is too dangerous." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I can't. I've already seen too much, and I'm in this with you now. I won't let them get away with it." Daniel stood up, his mind racing. "We're getting close to something big, Emily. I can feel it. But we need to be careful. If they know what we're doing, we could both lose everything." She nodded, but her eyes were determined. "Then we do it fast. We take everything we have to the press, to the authorities. Make it impossible for them to deny it." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. It was a risk, a huge risk. If they went public now, they'd be signing their own resignation letters. But if they waited too long, they might never get the chance. He exhaled slowly. "All right, let's finish this." They worked late into the night, organizing the documents, pulling together the pieces of the puzzle. As dawn began to break, Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard. It was time. But just as he was about to send the files to the press, his phone buzzed with a new message. "You're getting too close. Leave the files alone if you know what's good for you. You don't want to see what happens if you don't." The message was unsigned, but the threat was unmistakable. Daniel's hands trembled, but his resolve didn't waver. He was already in too deep to turn back. The air in the office felt colder now, even though the heat from the day before still lingered. Daniel stared at the phone, the message echoing in his mind. The threat was clear: back off or else. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, but he refused to be intimidated. He turned to Emily, who had been nervously pacing in the corner. "It's them," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "They know we're close." Emily looked pale, her face drawn with worry. "What are we going to do now? They won't stop. If they're this desperate to protect their secrets." Her voice trailed off, and she bit her lip. "We finish what we started," Daniel said, his eyes hardening with resolve. "We send the files to the press. They want us to be scared. They want us to back down. But we're not going to give them the satisfaction." Emily nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't go away. "But Daniel, we've got no protection. Once those files go out, we're exposed, and there's no going back." Daniel stood up and walked toward the window, his thoughts racing. He had seen it all before, Men with power would do anything to protect their empire, even if it meant destroying the lives of those who stood in their way. But he also knew something deeper. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of corruption and greed. Emily, if we don't do this, no one will ever know the truth. If we don't expose them, this will happen again to someone else. I can't let that happen. There was a long silence between them, the weight of his words sinking in. Emily finally stepped forward, her face set with determination. You're right. Let's finish this. With a steady hand, Daniel pressed send. The files went out. Everything he had gathered, every piece of evidence, all of it, directly to the press. There was no turning back now. They both stood there, the seconds ticking by like hours. Then, just as they were beginning to breathe again, the door to the office swung open. Mark stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He looked tired, as if he had just been through a battle himself. Mark, what's wrong? Daniel asked, his heart racing. Mark stepped inside, closing the door behind him. They know. Daniel's blood ran cold. What do you mean they know? Someone at the company found out what you're doing, Mark said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. And now they're coming for you. Before Daniel could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Mark's face paled. This is it. The door opened slowly, and standing in the doorway were two security officers, their faces stern. Behind them, a figure Daniel recognized stepped forward. The silver-haired man from the boardroom. You made a big mistake, Carter, the man said, his voice cold and cutting. You should have stayed in your lane. The air in the room thickened, and Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. This was the moment he had been preparing for, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Mark stepped in front of Daniel. You don't get to intimidate him anymore. This ends today. The silver-haired man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I think you'll find it's already too late. The room fell into an eerie silence as the two security officers advanced, their eyes cold and calculating. Mark stood firm in front of Daniel, but the tension in the air was palpable. Emily stood by the desk, her hands trembling, yet her resolve unbroken. The silver-haired man, the one who had been lurking in the background, smirked, his face twisted with disdain. You really thought you could just walk back in here, dig up everything, and expose us? He said, his voice dripping with condescension. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he refused to let fear control him. I'm not going anywhere, not until the truth comes out. His words were steady, his gaze unwavering. Mark turned to the security officers, his voice low but firm. You're not taking him anywhere. You can't just bully your way out of this. Not this time. The security officers exchanged a brief glance, but neither moved. The silver-haired man chuckled, stepping closer to Mark. You're still under the illusion that you have some power here, aren't you, Mark? Mark didn't flinch. I'm not playing games anymore. The tension was thick enough to suffocate. Then, without warning, the silver-haired man motioned to the officers. Take him, he ordered. Before Mark could react, one of the security officers lunged forward, grabbing Daniel by the arm. Daniel instinctively pulled back, but the officer's grip was unyielding. Let go of me, Daniel shouted, his voice rising, but the officer held him firm, dragging him toward the door. Mark tried to intervene, but the second officer blocked him. We're not asking you anymore, Carter, the silver-haired man sneered. You're going to regret this. But just as they were about to drag Daniel out, the sharp ring of Daniel's phone cut through the air. Everyone froze. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The phone was still in his pocket, but somehow he knew it was important. The message he had sent, everything he had gathered, had reached the press. The truth was about to explode, and they couldn't stop it now. The silver-haired man's eyes widened. What's that? He growled. Daniel, with all the strength he could muster, pulled the phone out of his pocket and unlocked it. His hand shook slightly as he glanced at the screen. The headline was already there, bold and glaring. Ex-employee exposes multi-million-dollar fraud inside major corporation. Former CEO involved. Daniel felt a rush of adrenaline. It was happening. The truth was finally out. With a final effort, he yanked his arm free from the security officer's grasp. The officer hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the silver-haired man, who was now visibly rattled. "No," the silver-haired man muttered, his face turning pale. Mark stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "You've lost. The world knows. It's over." The silver-haired man's mask of composure slipped, revealing the panic beneath. "You think they'll believe you? They'll bury this. I'll bury you." His voice was cold, but there was a tremor beneath the words. Before anyone could react, Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a flood of notifications, all from news outlets, confirming the story. The truth was out, and there was no hiding it anymore. The silver-haired man staggered backward, his voice faltering as he looked at the security officers, then at Mark and Daniel. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." But he didn't have the strength to finish his threat. He turned, his face a mixture of rage and fear, and left the room, followed by the officers. Daniel stood there, breathing heavily, still in disbelief. Emily rushed to his side. "It's really happening. They're going to pay for this." Mark turned to Daniel, his face serious but proud. "You did it, Carter. You brought them down." But Daniel wasn't so sure. The battle wasn't over yet. He knew that. The fight for justice was far from finished, and the people behind the fraud wouldn't go down without a fight. But for the first time since he'd returned, he felt a glimmer of hope. The truth had won. The room was still, the weight of what had just happened settling in. Daniel, Mark, and Emily stood together, each processing the aftermath in their own way. The phones continued to buzz with notifications, the world now fully aware of the lies that had been buried for so long. The articles had spread like wildfire, exposing the corruption that had been festering behind the company's polished facade. But as the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of what was to come hit harder than any threat they had faced before. The battle was far from over. Daniel looked out the window, the city skyline now bathed in the light of dawn. It was a strange feeling, a sense of victory, yes, but also a haunting sense of uncertainty. He had made his move, and the truth was finally out, but what would happen next? "They can't just walk away from this," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. Daniel nodded slowly. "No. They'll try to sweep it under the rug, but too many people know now. They'll have to answer for this." "But how?" Mark asked, his voice heavy with concern. "They've got the power. They'll have connections. We'll need more than just media coverage to bring them down." Daniel turned to face Mark. "We don't need just the media. We need law enforcement. We need the justice system. This isn't just about exposing them. It's about making sure they can't destroy any more lives." Emily stepped forward. "And we're ready for whatever comes next?" The question lingered in the air. Daniel knew what she was asking. Were they prepared for the full force of what was to come? They were already targets, and things would only get more dangerous. Looked at both of them, his resolve hardening. "We have no choice but to be ready. If we don't keep fighting, no one else will." But just as he said the words, a new message flashed on his phone screen. His heart skipped a beat. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "You think you've won? Think again. This is just the beginning. We know where you are." Daniel's stomach tightened. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just the beginning. As the realization set in, the three of them shared a knowing look. The silver-haired man wasn't the only enemy they had to face. There were others who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. But Daniel wasn't afraid anymore. They had the truth, and truth was power. "We keep going," he said, his voice firm. "We've come too far to stop now." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. "Let's finish this." And so, with the truth Finally, out in the open, Daniel, Emily, and Mark prepared for the fight of their lives. They knew they had taken down a significant part of the system, but there was still more to be done. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for every person who had been hurt, ignored, or crushed by the lies. But the storm was far from over, and the road ahead would be treacherous. Every step would take them closer to the heart of the corruption, and closer to the danger that awaited them. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind of activity. The media coverage intensified, but the company's leaders didn't remain silent for long. They quickly issued statements, claiming the allegations were false, that it was all a smear campaign, a desperate attack on their reputation. But Daniel, Emily, and Mark knew better. The evidence they had gathered couldn't be refuted. Still, they couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. Emily spent countless hours speaking with journalists, feeding them the information they needed to keep the story alive. She knew the more the media pushed, the harder it would be for the company to bury the truth. Mark had his own task, reaching out to law enforcement, making sure the authorities were aware of the full scope of the fraud. It wasn't just about exposing the company. It was about holding them accountable, making sure those responsible faced the consequences of their actions. But Daniel, he spent the nights on edge, waiting for something more, a response. And one day, it came. It was late in the afternoon when he received the call. His phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. His heart sank, but he answered anyway. "Carter?" The voice on the other end was deep, gruff, and instantly recognizable. It was the silver-haired man. "What do you want?" Daniel's voice was calm, but his insides were churning. "I think you know what I want," the man said coldly. "You've crossed a line, and now you're going to regret it. You think you're safe, but you're not. You don't understand who you're really up against." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, and neither are the people you've hurt." The silver-haired man's voice dropped to a whisper, filled with menace. "You're making a mistake, Carter. If you think the truth will save you, you're wrong. We can make this go away. But not if you keep pushing." "I'm not stopping," Daniel said firmly. "You should have thought of that before you decided to destroy lives. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been hurt by your lies." The man chuckled darkly. "Then let's see how far you're willing to go. I don't think you're ready for what happens next." Before Daniel could respond, the line went dead. His heart raced as he lowered the phone. It was clear now. The silver-haired man wasn't just a figurehead. He was a threat, one who would stop at nothing to protect his empire. But Daniel wasn't backing down. Not now. The phone call had only solidified what Daniel had known all along. This was no longer about exposing corruption. It was a war. A fight for survival. The next few hours were a blur. Daniel met with Emily and Mark in the office, their faces serious and focused. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was no fear in their eyes. "We've got everything we need," Daniel said. "We've made our stand. Now it's time to take the fight directly to them. We'll make sure they can't bury this." Emily nodded. "But we can't let them get to us first. We need to be careful." Mark stepped forward. "The authorities are on our side. They can't just make this disappear." But Daniel knew that the silver-haired man had the power to make things disappear, if he was allowed to act without interference. And that was exactly what they had to prevent. He looked at his team. "We keep pushing. We go public with everything. Every document, every email, every recording. We push them into a corner where they can't escape. The world needs to see who they really are." Emily and Mark exchanged glances, both resolute. "Let's do it," Emily said. As they moved forward with their plan, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the final battle was approaching. The silver-haired man wouldn't just fade into the background. He would come for them with everything he had. But Daniel was ready. They all were. The truth had taken root, and there was no going back. The days blurred together as the team worked tirelessly, finalizing the last pieces of their plan. Every second mattered now. With the press breathing down their necks and law enforcement stepping up their investigations, Daniel, Emily, and Mark knew that the silver-haired man was running out of time. But so were they. The tension in the air was suffocating, but the resolve in Daniel's heart never wavered. The phone call from the silver-haired man still echoed in his mind, but now it only fueled his determination. He knew they were on the verge of something huge, but they had to push harder, faster. They'd gone public with everything. The files were out in the open, the evidence irrefutable, but they couldn't afford to let up. One evening, just as the sun began to set, Daniel received another call. The number was blocked. He hesitated for a moment, but then answered, his breath catching in his throat. "This is Carter." The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. "You're making a big mistake, Carter. You should have stayed." Quiet. It was the silver-haired man again. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." There was a long pause before the man spoke again, his words dripping with venom. "You really think the press will save you? You think the authorities will protect you when they come after you? You're nothing to them. You're a pawn in a game you'll never win." Daniel could hear the desperation in the man's voice. It was the sound of someone losing control. But there was something else, something darker, more dangerous. "I'm not afraid of you," Daniel said, his voice filled with finality. "You're not going to intimidate me anymore. And when this is all over, you'll be the one who's buried." The line went silent. For a moment, Daniel thought the call had dropped, but then the silver-haired man spoke again, this time colder than ever. "Do you really think it will be that easy? You have no idea what you're up against." "I know exactly what I'm up against," Daniel replied. "And I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." The line clicked, and the call ended. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. The silver-haired man had lost all pretense of calm. He was scared, and that gave Daniel the strength to keep going. But there was no doubt. In his mind, things were about to get even harder. The next morning, the storm hit. The press had gotten wind of a new scandal, one even darker than the fraud they had already exposed. It was a series of hush-money payments to high-profile individuals, politicians, and even law enforcement. The silver-haired man's company wasn't just built on lies. It was built on corruption that reached into the very heart of society. Daniel couldn't believe what he was reading. But as he looked at the headlines, he felt something shift inside of him. This was bigger than he had imagined, and it was only going to get bigger. He gathered Emily and Mark. "This is it. We're not just exposing fraud anymore. We're going after the whole system. We have the proof. Now we take it all down." Mark's face was grim, but his eyes burned with a fire that matched Daniel's. "Let's bring them to their knees." Emily took a deep breath, looking at them both. "We've come this far. There's no turning back now." And they didn't. As they pushed forward, the pressure mounted. The silver-haired man had thrown everything he had at them: lawyers, threats, intimidation. But each time he struck, Daniel, Emily, and Mark stood stronger. The world had seen what they were capable of, and the truth had spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Then, finally, the inevitable happened. Law enforcement made a major breakthrough. The silver-haired man was arrested. His entire empire crumbled. The corruption, the lies, the manipulation, it all came crashing down in a matter of hours. The world watched as the once untouchable man was led out of his mansion in handcuffs. His empire, once a symbol of power, now lay in ruins. Daniel, Emily, and Mark stood together, watching the news unfold. They had won. But the price of victory was steep. It wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about the lives that had been shattered along the way, the damage done, and the long road to healing. "We did it," Emily said quietly, her voice filled with relief. Daniel nodded. "We did. But it doesn't end here. This is just the beginning." Mark's gaze was fixed on the TV screen. "Yeah, the fight for real change is just starting, but we're ready." They had taken down a giant. And in doing so, They had made sure the truth would never again be silenced. Thank you so much for following this incredible journey with us. We hope you were captivated by the twists, the suspense, and the unwavering fight for justice in Veteran. Shows up to his old job, the CEO's jaw-dropping reaction leaves everyone stunned. This story was all about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost, and we're glad you could be part of it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share with your friends. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us keep bringing you more exciting, emotional, and thought-provoking stories like this one. We love hearing your thoughts, so let us know what you think in the comments. Stay tuned for more incredible stories, and thanks again for being part of this journey.